Picture this. You're walking through your backyard on a quiet afternoon. You grab a shovel, start digging for no particular reason, and suddenly, clank, something hard. You dig faster, you brush away the dirt, and you realize it's not a rock, it's not a pipe, it's a solid vein of pure gold stretching deep into the earth beneath your feet.
In that single moment, every problem you've ever had disappears. The mortgage, gone. The credit card debt, gone. The job you hate, the boss you can't stand, the bills piling up on your kitchen counter, all of it, gone. You are free. You are rich. You have won.
We all know that feeling, even if only in our imagination, because we are taught from birth that money is the answer, that wealth is something physical you can find, hold, and possess, that if you just had enough of it, everything would be fine.
But what if I told you that the greatest financial windfall in human history didn't save a nation, it destroyed one? What if I told you that finding unlimited money is one of the most dangerous things that can ever happen to a country? Because history actually recorded the moment this happened. And the story is one of the most shocking economic cautionary tales ever told.
This is the story of Spain in the 16th century. The story of an empire that didn't just find a pot of gold, they found an entire mountain of silver. More wealth than had ever existed in the history of the world up to that point. They believed God Himself had chosen them. They believed they would rule the earth forever. Instead, they went bankrupt 3 times, lost their empire, hollowed out their economy, and turned the most powerful nation in Europe into a cautionary footnote.
This is the story of the Silver Curse, and it will change the way you think about money for the rest of your life.
To truly understand what happened, you have to understand what Europe looked like before the silver arrived. The continent in the late 1400s was not a prosperous place. It was still recovering from the Black Death. Wars were constant, resources were scarce, gold and silver were rare, and every coin in circulation was hard-earned precious metal. If you didn't have the metal, you couldn't buy anything. It was that simple. When Christopher Columbus returned from the Americas in 1492, he brought back a few gold trinkets. Not much, but just enough to start a fever. Over the next 50 years, Spanish adventurers known as Conquistadors flooded across the Atlantic in search of El Dorado, the legendary city of gold. Men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro were ruthless, brilliant, and utterly merciless. They toppled the Aztec Empire in Mexico. They dismantled the Inca Empire in Peru.
They melted down centuries of indigenous art and culture into silver bars without a second thought.
This initial loot made Spain rich. But loot is a one-time event. Once you melt down the statues, they're gone. Spain needed something sustainable. They needed a mine.
In 1545, they found one, and what they found defied all comprehension.
The story goes that an indigenous man named Diego Gualpa was searching for a lost llama high in the Andes Mountains of what is now Bolivia. The terrain was brutal, over 4,000 meters above sea level, freezing cold, the air so thin it burned your lungs. Diego slipped on a rocky slope and grabbed a bush to stop his fall. The bush came out by the roots, and there, in the hole where the roots had been, he saw a glint in the earth.
It was silver ore, extraordinarily pure silver ore. He had just discovered Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, a volcanic cone that was, by a freak of geology, essentially made of silver from the inside out. It was the largest single deposit of silver ever found on planet Earth.
Word spread like wildfire. Within months, thousands of Spaniards descended on that desolate Andean peak. They built a city at the base of the mountain. They called it Potosí. And within a few decades, Potosí had a population larger than London or Paris. It was a wild, violent, chaotic city of gambling dens, churches, brothels, and constant bloodshed. The Wild West 3 centuries before the American frontier. But what truly mattered was what was coming out of the ground.
Every year, thousands of tons of silver ore were extracted from the mountain, using a process that combined crushed ore with toxic mercury. The Spanish refined the metal into bars, minted into coins, the famous Spanish dollar, the piece of 8, and loaded them onto mules. Long convoys of animals carried the silver down from the Andes to the Pacific coast. From there it went by ship to Panama, overland through the jungle to the Atlantic, and then on to the great treasure galleons. Twice a year, a massive armed convoy set sail for Seville. Imagine standing on those docks in 1570. The horizon fills with white sails. Cathedral bells begin to ring across the city. People pour into the streets, running toward the harbor. And then the unloading begins. Bar after bar, sack after sack of coins, an endless river of money pouring into Spain. The king at this time was Philip II, arguably the most powerful man alive. He ruled Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, large portions of Italy, all of the Americas, and the Philippines. They said the sun never set on his empire, and now he had unlimited money flowing in from across the ocean. He looked at those treasure ships and believed with absolute certainty that God was rewarding him.
So he started spending. He built the Escorial, a colossal palace and monastery outside Madrid. He funded the arts. He created a new capital city. But mostly he spent the money on war. And war, then as now, is the most expensive thing a nation can do. Philip was fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. He was fighting Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, a conflict that would drag on for 80 years and consume resources at a staggering rate. He was fighting the French, and eventually he built the Spanish Armada to invade England. 130 ships, 30,000 men, all funded by silver from a mountain in Bolivia.
From the outside, Spain appeared unstoppable. The greatest army, the largest navy, the most money. But underneath the surface, something deeply wrong was quietly eating the empire alive.
The people of Spain were getting poorer.
This made no sense to anyone at the time. The country was drowning in silver. Wages were going up. A carpenter in Castile was earning 3 times what he had made 50 years earlier. But the price of bread had gone up 4 times. Cloth was 5 times more expensive. The cost of everything was exploding in ways that no one could explain or control.
They called it the price revolution. Merchants were blamed. Laws were passed to fix prices. Nothing worked, because the problem wasn't greed or conspiracy, it was pure mathematics. Spain had massively increased the supply of money without increasing the supply of goods. More coins chasing the same number of loaves of bread meant each loaf cost more coins. That is inflation. And this inflation began to quietly rot the foundation of the entire Spanish economy.
Because prices were so high inside Spain, everything manufactured there became too expensive to sell abroad. Spanish wool, once the finest in Europe, was priced out of the market. Spanish steel, legendary for its quality, couldn't compete internationally. Meanwhile, France, England, and the Dutch Republic didn't have silver mountains. Their prices stayed lower. Their goods stayed affordable.
So Spanish consumers did what any rational person does. They bought the cheaper imported products. A Spanish nobleman buying a velvet cloak chose the Dutch one, half the price. A farmer needing a new plow bought French rather than local. The silver didn't stay in Spain. It flowed straight through the country like water through a pipe, arriving at Seville and immediately draining out into the pockets of foreign merchants.
A Spanish economist of the era captured it perfectly, writing that Spain was like a mouth that receives food, warms it, and passes it to the stomach, which is the rest of Europe. Spain was doing all the chewing. Everyone else was getting the nutrition.
Spanish industry collapsed. Why build a factory when your costs are uncompetitive and foreign imports flood the market? The looms stopped weaving. The foundries went cold. An entire culture of productive labor began to disappear, replaced by a culture of leisure and aristocratic idleness. If silver was everywhere, why work with your hands? The rich bought titles and land. The poor flooded into cities to beg, join the church, or enlist in the army. The middle class, the productive backbone of any healthy economy, began to vanish.
And through all of this, the king kept spending money he didn't have. This is perhaps the most staggering part of the entire story. Philip II was spending the silver before the ships even docked. He was borrowing from German and Italian banking families, the Fuggers, the Welsers, pledging future treasure fleets as collateral for current loans. He was the world's most powerful monarch, living paycheck to paycheck on a continental scale, betting that the silver would never stop arriving.
Sometimes the ships sank in hurricanes. Sometimes pirates took the cargo. Sometimes the silver simply wasn't enough to cover the interest. The debt grew into a mountain that rivaled the mountain of silver itself.
In 1557, the crisis broke open. The wars were bleeding millions monthly. Ships were delayed. Bankers were demanding payment. And Philip II, master of the universe, ruler of half the world, declared national bankruptcy. He suspended all payments. Banks across Europe collapsed. Spanish soldiers in the Netherlands, unpaid for months, mutinied. They marched on Antwerp, the commercial heart of Northern Europe, and burned it. Thousands of civilians died.
It was called the Spanish Fury, and it turned the Dutch against Spain permanently, uniting the rebellion and exposing the empire's rotting core to the entire world.
Spain declared bankruptcy again in 1575 and again in 1596. 3 times in the reign of one king, the wealthiest nation on earth defaulted on its debt. The silver, meanwhile, continued its global journey, flowing from Spanish hands to Dutch merchants, from Dutch merchants to Asian traders, ultimately ending up in the treasury of the Chinese emperor, whose economy actually wanted it. The entire vast wealth of the Americas made a complete circle around the globe and disappeared. By the 17th century, Spain's decline was impossible to ignore. The population actually fell. Villages were abandoned. Fields went unplanted. The great galleons rotted in harbor. And in 1628, Dutch Admiral Piet Hein delivered the final humiliation, capturing the entire Spanish treasure fleet off the coast of Cuba in the greatest maritime heist in history. The Dutch used Spain's own stolen silver to fund the army that would ultimately defeat Spain. The irony was total. The mountain of Potosi still stands today, a scarred, tunnel-riddled red cone rising from the Bolivian plateau.
Men still go inside it searching for scraps. It is a monument not to wealth, but to the oldest and most expensive mistake a civilization can make: confusing money with wealth.
Wealth is a farm producing food. Wealth is a factory producing goods. Wealth is a shipyard building vessels. Wealth is an educated population capable of creating things other people want. Money is just how you keep score, and Spain had all the points on the scoreboard while systematically eliminating every player from the field.
We see this pattern repeat throughout history. Venezuela, sitting on the largest oil reserves on Earth, collapsed into poverty when oil prices fell because it had imported everything and built nothing. Tiny Nauru struck phosphate wealth and became the richest nation per capita on Earth for a decade, then went broke. The Dutch disease, economists call it, when resource wealth kills every other industry through inflation and neglect. And today, the warning is even more urgent. We no longer need silver mountains. We have central banks that create trillions with a keystroke. We flooded the global economy with money in 2008 and again in 2020. And just as in 16th century Spain, we are watching housing prices explode, food costs surge, and manufacturing hollow out because it's cheaper to import than produce domestically.
Philip II is not a figure from ancient history. He is a warning written in the collapse of an empire. The king who owned the world and died bankrupt. The ships sailing into Seville, heavy with treasure, while people starved in the streets outside.
The curse of Potosi is not a myth. It is a mathematical certainty. You cannot consume more than you produce forever. You cannot mistake the score for the game itself. And every civilization that has tried, without exception, has eventually learned that lesson the hard way.
The only question that remains is whether we will be the ones who finally learn it differently.
If this story made you think differently about money, wealth, and the world we live in, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next deep dive into the hidden forces shaping history and our future. The stories that don't make the headlines are often the ones that matter most. See you in the next one.